Relations between the U.S. and Colombia are experiencing a sharp deterioration. Washington has suspended financial aid to Bogotá and threatened to impose trade tariffs after Colombian President Gustavo Petro accused the U.S. of violating his country's sovereignty and killing a Colombian fisherman during an American anti-drug operation. U.S. President Donald Trump called Petro a drug lord and warned that the U.S. will do it for him, that is, destroy the death fields of drug trafficking itself, if Colombia does not close them immediately. In response, Bogotá recalled its ambassador from Washington for consultations, and protests took place outside the U.S. embassy in the Colombian capital. The confrontation between the two countries, caused by the war on drug cartels and exacerbated by political differences, is raising serious concerns and questions about the possible consequences of the conflict for the region. The immediate cause of the conflict was the fight against drug trafficking. In recent months, Washington has launched a large-scale military campaign in the Caribbean, declaring a kind of war on drug cartels. The U.S. has sent large forces, including 4,500 military personnel, to the shores of Latin America, and since September 2025, has been launching missile strikes on ships that, according to the White House, are transporting drugs. One of the targets of this operation was a Colombian boat drifting in the Caribbean Sea. Fisherman Alejandro Carranza was killed in the attack on September 16th. Petro claimed that the vessel had sent a distress signal and was not carrying any contraband, accusing the U.S. of murder and border violation. This situation provoked a sharp response from Trump. Officially, the American campaign is directed against Venezuelan drug trafficking channels. According to U.S. statements, dozens of people have been killed in recent weeks on ships suspected of transporting drugs from Venezuela, including the destruction of a large submarine allegedly loaded with fentanyl. However, Washington has not provided any evidence to support these accusations. The conflict also has political undertones. Gustavo Petro, Colombia's first left-wing president, is pursuing a more independent course in foreign and domestic policy, which irritates the U.S. leadership. In particular, Petro has renounced the previous strategy of forcibly eradicating drug crops, placing emphasis on socio-economic measures. In addition, he has openly criticized the U.S. on the international stage. In September 2025, during the 80th session of the UN General Assembly, Petro took part in a demonstration in support of Palestine in New York and called on American soldiers not to aim their rifles at humanity and not to obey Trump's orders. After that, the U.S. State Department revoked the Colombian leader's entry visa. Experts note that Trump, known for his emotional reactions, may have taken Petro's actions as a personal insult. Although Trump often changes his anger to mercy, he initially acts impulsively. Thus, personal resentment and ideological differences have added to the list of reasons for the crisis. Some observers compare the current situation to a return to the Monroe Doctrine, a long-standing U.S. policy that proclaimed its special influence in the Western Hemisphere. According to experts, the current actions of the Trump administration largely correspond to the updated Monroe Doctrine. In fact, the White House is once again justifying expansion and interference in the internal affairs of countries in the region by fighting the threat of drugs. The American press has even coined the term Donroe Doctrine to describe Trump's ambitions, alluding to the combination of Donald's name with Monroe. Washington's claims not only to Latin America, but also to territories such as Greenland and the Panama Canal. In practice, this translates into a hard line against left-wing governments in the region. Yes, Colombia and a number of other countries do produce a significant portion of the world's drugs, analysts acknowledge. But even leading experts have called statements that the Colombian state is at the forefront of this business nonsense, saying that current events demonstrate the extent of the U.S. president's complete ignorance of what is happening in Latin America, or a deliberate distortion of reality to justify his course of action. On Trump's part, the ultimatum to Bogotá may also be an attempt to force it to make further concessions. Experts point to several additional reasons why Washington may have deliberately escalated relations with Bogotá. The first is Trump's attempt to secure more favorable terms of cooperation for the U.S. His harsh statements may be nothing more than a bargaining chip, followed by his traditional demonstrative success in negotiations. Most likely, it will all end with a public statement about mutual achievements in the fight against drug trafficking. The second version is related to Trump's personal resentment towards Colombian President Petro. His open opposition and unwillingness to follow in the wake of American policy could have provoked a response, sharp political pressure, and a demonstrative cooling of relations. The third possible reason is the upcoming presidential elections in Colombia, scheduled for 2026. The White House is likely interested in seeing Petro replaced by a leader more favorable to Washington. The U.S. believes that the chances of the left retaining power are minimal, and that a right-wing candidate is likely to win in the next political cycle. From this point of view, the deterioration of relations may be part of a strategy aimed at supporting the opposition and strengthening U.S. influence in the region. Colombia is seen as a potential springboard for pressure on Venezuela and other Latin American states that do not follow the American line. Overall, analysts believe that the conflict is unlikely to be long-lasting. Colombian politics has traditionally been closely linked to Washington, and even despite Petro's loud statements, his country is unlikely to distance itself from the United States for long. Everything indicates that the current confrontation is more personal and temporary than systemic. The United States responded to Bogotá's accusations with extreme harshness. On October 19th, Donald Trump announced that Washington would no longer send Colombia any payments or subsidies, effectively ending years of financial aid. According to experts, the annual volume of U.S. tranches amounted to $500 million. At the same time, Trump ordered Colombia to be stripped of its trade preferences. He promised to impose 25% tariffs on all Colombian exports to the U.S. The White House had already applied a similar measure in January 2025 when Bogotá refused to take back Colombian migrants deported from America. Now, Colombia's insufficient fight against drugs is cited as the reason. The U.S. president publicly launched a tirade on social media, calling Gustavo Petro a narco leader who encourages large-scale drug production, claiming that it has become the biggest business in Colombia, and that Petro himself is allegedly doing nothing to remedy the situation. "We have been subsidizing Colombia for a long time, essentially robbing America," Trump said, stressing that the U.S.'s patience has run out. He warned that the U.S. may resort to forceful measures against Colombia if its authorities do not urgently step up the fight against drug plantations. Petro must immediately close these fields of death. Otherwise, the U.S. will do it for him, but he won't like it, the American leader threatened. Congress supported this position. Senator Lindsey Graham confirmed that the White House is ready to officially announce new trade tariffs in the coming days. Thus, the U.S. has moved to direct economic pressure and rhetoric of forceful coercion against one of its seemingly allies. The Colombian leadership rejected the accusations and took diplomatic countermeasures. Gustavo Petro strongly refuted Trump's allegations of involvement in the drug trade. "The problem is Trump, not the U.S. Mr. Trump, you are rude and ignorant about Colombia. I am not in business like you. I am a socialist. If I am not a businessman, let alone a drug dealer, then there is no room for greed in my heart," Petro said, reacting emotionally to his opponent's attack. Bogotá has officially demanded an explanation from Washington regarding the incident off its coast when the U.S. military attacked a civilian vessel. The president stressed that the fishing boat was drifting with its engine raised, sending a distress signal, so he considers the U.S. actions to be arbitrary violence. Having received no apology, the Colombian government took an unprecedented step. On October 20th, the Foreign Ministry announced the recall of Ambassador Daniel Garcia Pina from Washington for consultations with the president. The ambassador has already arrived in Bogotá, and the authorities have stated that they will announce further decisions regarding the U.S. in the near future. At the same time, protests broke out in Colombia itself, reflecting public outrage. Thousands of representatives of indigenous peoples and social movements gathered in Bogotá, demanding that the government protect national dignity. On October 17th, some of the demonstrators rioted outside the U.S. Embassy. A radical group of participants armed with bows and Molotov cocktails attacked the police guarding the complex. 4 law enforcement officers were injured, some with arrows in their hands and legs. President Petro called on protesters to exercise restraint and ordered that the security of the U.S. Embassy be ensured, stressing that Colombia strictly complies with its international obligations to protect diplomatic missions. Nevertheless, the scale and intensity of the protests demonstrated the level of anti-American sentiment. The country's political elite was also divided in its opinions. Part of the right-wing opposition supported Trump's harsh statements, accusing Petro of provoking the scandal, while the president's supporters, on the contrary, called on Washington to acknowledge its own responsibility for the demand for drugs in the U.S. Economic consequences. The conflict with the U.S. poses a direct threat to Colombia's economy. The American market and aid have traditionally played an important role in the Colombian economy. The U.S. is one of the country's largest trading partners, so the introduction of high tariffs will inevitably hit Colombian exports, from flowers and coffee to oil. The freeze on financial support deprives Bogotá of hundreds of millions of dollars in targeted funds. This money previously went to rural development programs and the fight against drug trafficking, and its loss could affect the socio-economic situation. Even more serious is the prospect of a reduction in remittances from Colombian migrants in the U.S., which amount to several $billions a year. If Washington tightens its immigration policy or hinders such transfers, Colombia's economy will experience a powerful shock. It is effectively being blackmailed with the threat of economic destabilization, and this is causing concern among Colombian society. Unilateral U.S. military action in the fight against drug trafficking calls into question compliance with international law and human rights. The U.S. military operating in the Caribbean has already destroyed several dozen suspected vessels without trial or investigation. Human rights activists say such strikes are illegal because the military has no right to attack civilian targets that do not pose an immediate threat. If the practice of preemptive strikes continues, it will set a dangerous precedent. The death of the peaceful fisherman Carranza is an alarming sign. Other residents of coastal regions who accidentally come under attack could find themselves in a similar situation. The escalation of force threatens to have humanitarian consequences, especially if the fighting, even if limited, spreads to Colombian territory. Thousands of residents of the border areas of Venezuela and Colombia are already at risk. If the situation continues to escalate, there could be an increase in refugee flows, a rise in violence in regions affected by drug cartels, and other phenomena associated with the crisis. The most serious risk is that the conflict could escalate into direct armed confrontation. Although experts doubt that the U.S. will decide on a full-scale invasion of Colombia, the threat of pinpoint strikes on Colombian territory is very real. Trump's statement about his readiness to do it for him is perceived by some as a hint at possible raids against drug infrastructure inside Colombia. If even one missile or bomb falls on Colombian soil, Bogotá will most likely respond with maximum force, up to and including severing diplomatic relations and appealing to the UN Security Council. Neighboring countries, primarily Venezuela, will not remain on the sidelines either. Caracas has already begun to transfer troops to the Caribbean coast in response to U.S. strikes on ships, officially explaining this as necessary to protect its territory. If the situation continues to escalate, a regional anti-war bloc may form. The ALBA countries, Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, etc., will support Colombia, while pro-American governments, such as Ecuador or Guatemala, may support U.S. actions. Either way, military escalation threatens to destabilize the entire subcontinent. Even if a direct confrontation can be avoided, the current crisis is diverting resources and attention away from other threats, such as the situation in Venezuela, and undermining U.S. efforts, as it is impossible to fight on all fronts at once. For Colombia itself, the conflict also carries internal risks. Economic difficulties due to sanctions could undermine social stability. Rising prices, job losses in export industries, and declining investment will hit the population hard. This could provoke new protests and deepen the divide in society between supporters of a tough stance against drugs, mafia, and adherents of Petro's sovereign policy. On the eve of the 2026 elections, such tensions are dangerous. They could lead to political violence, coup attempts, or interference by external forces in the electoral process. The radicalization of society is another possible undesirable effect. Voices are already being heard accusing the U.S. of all the country's ills, or conversely calling for Petro's leftist regime to be removed at any cost. Thus, the continuation of the conflict threatens Colombia with a period of deep internal turmoil. The situation surrounding Colombia cannot be viewed in isolation from the overall picture in Latin America. Trump's aggressive statements and show of force in the Caribbean have sent a signal to the entire region that the U.S. intends to actively defend its dominance in the Western Hemisphere once again. Historically, the Monroe Doctrine, 1893, served as a justification for U.S. leadership and intervention in the affairs of Latin American countries. In 2013, Washington formally announced its rejection of this doctrine, recognizing multipolarity in the Americas. However, Trump's return to the White House has been marked by rhetoric that effectively revives Monroe's principles. Analysts have already begun talking about a new Monroe Doctrine, under which Trump is extending his ambitions to the entire continent. For example, in addition to Latin American affairs, he has openly expressed interest in purchasing Greenland and dissatisfaction with non-American control of the Panama Canal, With regard to South America, the current administration has taken a tough stance. Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua have been labeled enemies of democracy, and governments that cooperate with them, including Petro's Colombia, are being pressured. The escalation between the U.S. and Colombia is happening at the same time as things are heating up around Venezuela. Officially, the U.S. military presence off the coast of Colombia is justified by the need to fight Venezuelan drug cartels and the regime of Nicolás Maduro. The Caribbean Sea is currently home to the largest U.S. Navy group in decades. According to media reports, ships with a total crew of over 4,000 have been sent to the region. American operations are effectively affecting the waters and interests of several countries at once. There have been reports of incidents involving ships sailing from Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia. Venezuela perceived the attacks on ships as a direct threat to its security and began military maneuvers pulling troops to potentially vulnerable areas. This development is causing concern throughout the region, bringing to mind parallels with the past, when the U.S. has already carried out military actions under the pretext of fighting drugs. For example, the invasion of Panama in 1989. Now, as then, Latin American neighbors fear a violation of the principle of sovereignty. Some allies and regional associations have already spoken out in support of Colombia, and the issue is expected to be raised at the upcoming CELAC, Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, and OAS summits. For many Latin American countries, the position is a matter of principle. They may not approve of drug trafficking, but they also consider armed intervention by a foreign power unacceptable. Latin America is currently experiencing a noticeable ideological split. Some countries adhere to left-wing positions and try to act independently of the U.S. These include Venezuela, Bolivia, parts of Mexico, and until recently, Colombia. Others, on the contrary, are oriented toward Washington and take a pro-American position. Among them, Ecuador, Guatemala, and Uruguay. The conflict between the U.S. and Colombia is likely to further deepen this division. Washington is clearly betting on the support of right-wing political forces to isolate governments that do not fit into its strategy. At the same time, Colombia is seen as an important element of pressure on Venezuela. A change of power in Bogotá to a government more loyal to the White House could strengthen American influence and weaken Caracas' position. The situation in Brazil is also of additional importance. Elections will be held there in 2026, and if allies of former President Bolsonaro, who is known for his close ties to the U.S., come to power, this will create favorable conditions for the formation of a united right-wing bloc in the region. In that case, the United States would be able to consolidate several large South American states around itself and resume attempts at a political and economic blockade of Venezuela, similar to those already undertaken in the past. Therefore, the fate of the current crisis between Washington and Bogotá goes far beyond bilateral relations. It will largely determine the ideological balance of power across the continent. The current confrontation between the U.S. and Colombia could develop in several directions, from a gradual settlement to a dangerous escalation. One of the most likely options remains diplomatic détente. Both sides, tired of mutual accusations, may try to reduce tensions and find a compromise. Trump often uses pressure as a negotiating tool, and the current crisis may well end behind closed doors. After exchanging loud statements, Washington and Bogotá may move on to secret negotiations, where Colombia will agree to fight drug cartels more actively, and the U.S. will respond by easing tariff pressure and restoring some funding. In this case, each side will save face. Trump will be able to present it as a diplomatic victory, and Petro as a successful defense of national interests. Thus, the crisis will gradually fade away, and cooperation will resume without any loud political losses. Another scenario involves a wait-and-see tactic in the upcoming elections in Colombia. Until 2026, the confrontation may remain frozen. The parties will limit themselves to harsh rhetoric and a temporary cooling of contacts. The White House will likely bet on a change of power in Bogotá, hoping that voters themselves will bring a more U.S.-friendly leader to power. According to polls, the left's position has weakened, and Petro's chances of retaining his post are minimal. A victory for the center-right candidate will pave the way for a restart of relations. Colombia will once again receive U.S. aid, sign new security agreements, and distance itself from the Venezuelan government. For Washington, this would be a convenient outcome. The conflict would end on its own without direct intervention, and Colombia's return to a pro-American course would confirm the effectiveness of its pressure policy. Until the election, relations are likely to remain cold, but without escalating into open confrontation. The least favorable option is a sharp escalation that could develop into a regional crisis. If Washington decides to carry out its threats and take military action, for example, by striking targets associated with the drug trade, this will inevitably lead to a clash. Colombia will respond by defending its territory, and Venezuela and other allies of Petro may provide diplomatic or even military support. Dangerous incidents are possible in the region. Naval skirmishes, blockades of transport routes, and retaliatory sanctions. The U.S. in turn may declare a naval blockade under the pretext of combating drug trafficking, which will provoke international condemnation and a crisis in the UN. This situation would split Latin America into two camps, pro-American and anti-imperialist, creating a new Cold War similar to the one seen in the 20th century. For Colombia itself, such a development would have serious consequences: economic isolation, loss of markets, sanctions, and the risk of armed conflict. Whichever of these scenarios comes to pass, the current crisis has already become a serious test for relations between Washington and Bogotá. It has exposed old contradictions between the politics of power and the idea of sovereignty, between different views on the fight against drug trafficking, and between the unipolar strategy of the U.S. and the new multipolar reality. The outcome of this confrontation will affect not only the two countries but the entire region, from the economic stability of the Andean belt to the distribution of influence across the American continent. However, the crisis could also be a turning point. Either the U.S. and Colombia will find a way to build a renewed partnership based on mutual respect, or the world will witness Latin America becoming an arena for a new geopolitical confrontation with unpredictable consequences.